Welcome to meeting number 11 of the House of Commons Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. Pursuant to the order of reference of July 20, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study on Canada-China relations. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference. Oh, and I'm sorry I had it on the floor channel, but I don't know if interpretation was working. I'm going to switch now to French. Voici.
Here are a few rules to follow to ensure we have a good meeting. For this video conference, interpretation service will work as they usually do for a regular meeting. At the bottom of your screen, you can choose either floor English or French. When you have the floor, if you want to change languages, you have to switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you are speaking. You may want to allow for short pause when switching languages. Before speaking, please wait till I give you the floor by saying your name. When you're ready to speak, click on the little microphone to activate your mic. I would remind you that you should make all your comments, members and witnesses should make all their comments through the chair. Members who like to speak outside their speaking time should activate their microphone and indicate that they want to make a point of order. If members want to intervene on a point of order raised by another member, they should use the raised hand function to indicate to the chair that they want to speak. In order to do so, you should click on participant at the bottom of the screen. The list of names will appear, and next to your name, you will see the option to raise your hand. Please ensure to speak loudly and clearly. When you do not have the floor, please put your microphone on mute. We highly recommend the use of a headset with a boom mic.
Get started. Can everyone click on their screen in the top right-hand corner and ensure that they are on gallery view? With this view, you should be able to see all the participants in a grid view. It will ensure that all video participants can see one another. As is the case during in-person meetings, the public will only see the participant who is speaking. It's now my pleasure to welcome our first panel of witnesses. From Columbia University, Michael C. Davis, Professor, Weatherhead East Asia Institute, Woodrow Wilson International Center.
Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur Bergeron,
Monsieur le Président, si vous...
Mr. Chair, if I may. Mr. Bergeron, do you have a problem? No, there isn't a problem, but I want to avoid that I want to prevent any problem. You might remember that at the last meeting, there was a problem with interpretation because the witnesses did not tune into interpretation. They were tuned onto the floor channel, and they couldn't get the interpretation, and I couldn't be heard by the witnesses when I was asking my questions. So I want to make sure that I want you to make sure that the witnesses are on the right channel, on the English channel, so that they can hear the interpretation. I don't want to go through what we went through last time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your patience. You're welcome, Mr. Bergeron. It's a very important point you're making, and I'm sure that all witnesses heard your intervention and that they know what to do.
So, from Hong Kong Watch, we have Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chair. From the Toronto Association for Democracy in China, we have, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, Chuk Kwan, immediate past chair, and Avi Yao Go, board member, barrister and solicitor, clinic director, Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. Each witness or organization will have up to 10 minutes to make an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from the members. And I just want to make it clear to the witnesses that once a member is started to ask you questions, I'm asking the members to indicate who they would like to respond or in which order they'd like you to respond, because I think that will save us time. And you don't, once someone's called upon, once one of the members in their period for questions has asked you to comment, you don't need to wait for me to call on you. Okay, so we'll start then, if we may, with Professor Davis for up to 10 minutes. Please proceed.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting me. I hope I'm heard okay. Okay, thank you. I should note, in addition to being a U.S. scholar nowadays, I spent 30 years in Hong Kong as a professor of constitutional law and human rights, and I continue to teach there. I'll be teaching 2 human rights courses via Zoom this fall, so I'm very much involved. I've been a public intellectual in Hong Kong throughout these many years. What I want to talk about, probably as the constitutional lawyer that's starting this testimony, is about the rule of law and the national security law that's now been imposed on Hong Kong. There's a number of questions in this law. The law itself seems to have a status as high as the basic law of Hong Kong. In fact, I would say it's higher, because under Chinese national law and legislation, the last law enacted, as is common in many countries, the last law enacted takes precedent over any conflicts with previous laws. So the basic law of Hong Kong is an older law, it's more general. The national security law is more specific. The way it was enacted already had imposed something on Hong Kong in a very offensive way. None of the law was leaked to the public until the day it was promulgated. We were told even the chief executive did not know what was in the law. So contrary to China's own laws, national law and legislation, and Hong Kong's practice, there was no consultation with the public. This law was just imposed on Hong Kong. The national security law, on its face, it says that it's superior to all local laws. And I would argue effectively that includes the basic law of Hong Kong, which is the foundation of rights protection in Hong Kong. The national security law says explicitly that, I guess you could say that the courts cannot really review it. It's not subject to constitutional review. It's not subject to review under the basic law. So if a judge receives this law in court, he has to pretty much apply it. And the National People's Congress Standing Committee has the ultimate power to interpret it. So that the idea that the courts would stand as a guardian to protect us is not there. In Hong Kong, and I can say I'm a resident of Hong Kong, so I refer to it as us, but in Hong Kong, we will have no opportunity to challenge some of the provisions in this law on subversion, sedition, on collusion with foreign governments, and so on, if this matter is brought to court. And then there's an interesting twist in the law. It provides that only selected judges on a list can actually hear cases under the national security law. And the chief executive of Hong Kong is to construct that list. Now, if a judge is on that list and he hears cases, if he acts in or makes statements in any way that violate national security, then that judge will be dismissed from hearing such cases. Now, in Hong Kong, one of the ways that Hong Kong was to preserve the rule of law in the face of the mainland system, which really doesn't have the rule of law, was that foreign judges, including Canadian ones, sit on Hong Kong courts. Well, they will not be sitting on these national security cases because they will not be on the list of judges chosen by the chief executive of Hong Kong. So presumably the choice would be influenced by the expectation of how those judges would behave. Now, given all of this sort of pressure on judges, one would wonder what they would do if they're confronted with statements coming out of the foreign ministry in Beijing or coming from mainland officials now appointed in Hong Kong, saying what they think, how a case should be treated. Now, we don't have to guess at this. Just this week, Jimmy Lai, the publisher of the Apple Daily, was arrested. While the Hong Kong officials referred to him as a suspect, he was suspected of collusion, apparently because he provided funding for an organization, much like some of the organizations that are represented in testimony today, that lobby foreign governments, usually Hong Kong overseas Hong Kong actors. So we don't know for sure because the enforcement of this law is done secretly. So we have a kind of secret police going on now. But presumably the word on the street, as it were, is that he funded an organization called Stand with Hong Kong. So we'll see if that proves to be the case. Interestingly, the foreign ministry immediately insulted him and said that he represented a great threat to security, national security in Hong Kong. I forget the precise words, but in any event, they almost prejudged the case. Now, how will a judge react to this? If legal issues come up, knowing that the NPC can override their interpretation, how will they respond to these statements by mainland officials condemning the defendant before he is tried? Now, the autonomy of Hong Kong is very important. The reason autonomy was given Hong Kong because the mainland system is very much at odds with the Hong Kong system. In Hong Kong, as in Canada, we have the rule of law. In the mainland system, the common characterization is rule by law, where officials sort of stand above the law and take great liberties in interpreting the law. Now, the autonomy is undermined in two ways. One is a local committee is created, headed by the chief executive, to oversee national security matters, and all national security matters are under this committee locally. She would oversee what police can do, and this committee has already issued regulations on how the police can behave, which enables searches without warrants. For one thing, there are judges, magistrates who can issue warrants, but those are not needed if the law enforcement officers feel that there's some kind of urgency where they could go ahead and search in advance. So this is one problem. And within the police now, there's a special unit on national security. And within the prosecution, there's also a special unit on national security. So all of this is well lined up. And this committee that oversees all of this in Hong Kong answers directly to the Central People's Government. So autonomy effectively goes out the window in this most sensitive area for Hong Kong's autonomy. Of course, national security is the most sensitive area. And then on top of that, there's a mainland office on the safeguarding of national security that's totally staffed with mainland officials. Now, why they need that, I don't know, because they've also placed an advisor in the local committee. So they have an advisor in the local committee that is to advise, but given that the central government is overriding the local committee, presumably that advisor can already supervise local actions. But there is a separate office, and the office is totally staffed with mainland officials and people from the state security and the public security branches on the mainland will staff that office. And neither the local committee nor that office are subject to review by the local courts. It expressly says in this law that the local committee is not subject to review, and it says that local courts have no jurisdiction over that so-called office for safeguarding national security. So Hong Kong's rule of law pretty much goes out the window here. And there's a long history in Hong Kong of mainland officials actually saying when courts in Hong Kong have exercised constitutional review, the mainland officials often say there's supposed to be no separation of powers in Hong Kong. So the idea of the court stepping up boldly and challenging what mainland officials say is going to be very difficult. So these are the kinds of problems that I thought worth highlighting here at the start of this hearing, because I'm sure a lot of the events that bear out my concerns have occurred, and I imagine other speakers will talk about them. It's interesting to me that mainland officials in this national office, this office set up in Hong Kong, may not even be subject to any law in a way, because under Hong Kong's basic law, only laws in the Annex 3 of the basic law apply in Hong Kong. So if a mainland official does something that violates mainland law, there will be no jurisdiction over him. And in the exercise of his duties, if he violates local law, there'll be no jurisdiction over him. So we have a kind of secret police who have no real control over them. And this, I think, and I'll close with this, for Hong Kong, these things are very important because these things are at the heart of why we have one country, two systems. The mainland officials can claim if they want that they're upholding one country, two systems. But the reality is that the one country, two systems was to be upheld by the institutions in Hong Kong, which were separate from the mainland systems. And that separation has been totally collapsed. There's a long essay I could write on human rights protections here as well, but my time is up and I'd be happy to entertain questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis. And now we'll call upon Mr. Rogers from Hong Kong Watch. Mr. Rogers, please, for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and committee. Can I just check that you can hear me? Great. Well, it's a privilege to have this opportunity to speak to you today at this critical time for Hong Kong, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Hong Kong has seen many dark days over the past 12 months, and Monday this week, as has already been mentioned, was among the darkest. The arrests not only of Jimmy Lai, but also Agnes Chow, yet another brazen assault on Hong Kong's civil liberties, and really the death knell for press freedom in particular. As has already been so ably outlined by the first witness, the imposition of this draconian national security law by the National People's Congress on the 1st of July essentially has destroyed Hong Kong's autonomy. It marks the end of one country, two systems. It's placed many activists in very grave danger, and it's a flagrant violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And if you didn't already guess from my accent, I'm from the UK and speaking to you from the UK. And that, of course, is an international treaty that is lodged at the United Nations. And so for these reasons, and also due to the extraterritorial application of the new security law, which incidentally is worth saying, applies to people, whether they are Hong Kongers or not, whether they're inside Hong Kong or outside Hong Kong, and in effect means that meetings like the one we're holding now could be in violation of Hong Kong's security law. It represents an all-out assault, not only on Hong Kong's freedoms and way of life, but also on the international rules-based order. The subsequent disqualification of pro-democracy candidates for the Legislative Council's elections scheduled for September, and then the postponement for a year of those very elections, disenfranchises Hong Kong people and shuts down one of the few remaining avenues that they had for some level of freedom of expression. In effect, these events signify the total takeover of Hong Kong by the Chinese Communist Party system. As the Hong Kong Bar Association has said, the national security law undermines fundamental rights and liberties and the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. Among the many human rights violations to highlight, the widespread, consistent, disproportionate and indiscriminate brutality by the Hong Kong police over the past 12 months in particular requires particular attention. A recent inquiry conducted by the British Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on Hong Kong into violations of human rights and humanitarian principles by the Hong Kong police force found in particular that, and I quote, humanitarian aid workers have been subjected to a variety of treatment that fell short of international humanitarian law and principles, international human rights, and the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The treatment of aid workers was subjected to, included intimidation, harassments, threats, physical violence, and arrests. The all-party group, in its recently published report titled "The Shrinking Safe Space for Humanitarian Aid Workers in Hong Kong," calls, among other steps, for the establishment of an independent mechanism to investigate the situation in Hong Kong, either through the United Nations Human Rights Council or General Assembly, or through a body such as the International Bar Association. It also calls for the imposition of Magnitsky sanctions on those responsible for permitting excessive police violence in Hong Kong, including, but not limited to, Chief Executive Carrie Lam and the Police Commissioner. Let me move on to some specific recommendations for Canada, and I do so with all humility. It's not for me to sit here in Britain and tell Canada what it should do, but these are suggestions that you might like to consider, perhaps together with my own country. I really welcome Canada's decision to suspend the extradition agreement with Hong Kong, but I believe that there is more that could and should be done. Firstly, I would encourage Canada to work with other like-minded countries to establish an international contact group to coordinate a global response to this crisis. This is an idea that's been put forward by 7 former British foreign secretaries. And of course, the early foundations for this have already been laid by the fact that your foreign minister has joined together with his counterparts from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States on several occasions in statements, and this is very welcome. But I think more could be done to solidify coordination among democratic nations to ensure that the response to this crisis is not simply rhetorical nor piecemeal, but is robust, rapid, unified, and as coordinated as possible. Secondly, I would encourage Canada to impose Magnitsky targeted sanctions on officials in the Hong Kong government and police force and the Chinese government responsible for human rights violations and for this breach of an international treaty. Such sanctions would be extremely helpful because they would be targeted. We don't advocate sanctions against China or Hong Kong or the people of those two places, but on individual officials directly responsible. And I believe that the Chinese regime does not respond to rhetoric or statements. The only language they understand is pressure, and targeted sanctions would send a clear signal that they would not be allowed to get away with what they've done with impunity. Thirdly, I would encourage Canada to publicly support calls for the establishment of a UN Special Envoy and a UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Hong Kong, a proposal advocated by at least 50 current UN Special Rapporteurs, several former rapporteurs, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the last Governor of Hong Kong, Lord Patton, and indeed the chairs of the Foreign Affairs Committees of your own Parliament, together with the Parliaments of Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, shining a spotlight on Hong Kong through a monitoring and reporting mechanism at the UN would be very important in ensuring that human rights violations are not perpetrated with impunity. And finally, I would urge Canada to, again, work with other countries to coordinate a lifeboat rescue package to ensure that those who do need to escape from Hong Kong are offered sanctuary and an opportunity to seek citizenship in the free world. This should only be a last resort. The objective should be to exert pressure to prevent Hong Kong deteriorating further into a situation where people need to flee. But the reality is that it is already at an extremely dangerous point. Some activists have already fled the city, and more Hong Kongers will do so in the months and years ahead, either because they are in real danger or simply because they see no future in a city that is stripped of its freedoms. The United Kingdom, as I'm sure you're aware, has made a very generous offer to Hong Kong's British national overseas passport holders, which is very welcome. But it leaves many of Hong Kong's young people, especially frontline activists, unprotected because nobody born after 1997 qualifies. Canada could help address this need in various ways. So I just close by raising the question, why should any of this concern Canada? And I would say for 3 reasons. Firstly, because of your history, and you don't need me to tell you about that. Secondly, because you are a country that prides itself on the defense of freedom and human rights. And thirdly, because the Sino-British Joint Declaration is not only an agreement between Britain and China, but it is an international treaty that concerns all of us who believe in the international rules-based system. I believe the time has come for the free world to act in defense of freedom, democracy, and human rights and the international rules-based order. And that action should be as strong, targeted, and united as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. And we'll now hear from the Toronto Association for Democracy in China. Will it be Ms. Go or Mr. Kwan first?
I will go first, Mr. Kwan.
Please go ahead.
On behalf of the Toronto Association for Democracy in China, I wish to thank the committee for this series of hearings on the situation in Hong Kong. For too long, we believed that China will abide by international rules of engagement and diplomatic civility, as well as the respect for the fundamental concepts of rule of law. This illusion has now been shattered by the arbitrary arrest of the two Michaels and the retroactive application of the national security law in Hong Kong. For this presentation, we will focus on two areas that we, as Canadians, can undertake. First, how to counter China's interventions and interference and protect our Canadian interests and values. Second, what specific programs Canada should adopt to support those in Hong Kong who try to leave. I will address the first, and my colleague A.B. Goh will address the second issue. Since Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, China has made a concerted effort to mask its human rights abuses and to present a positive image to advance its global ambition. It has set up hundreds of proxy associations in Canada, many of them empty shells, to influence and interfere in Canadian political, social, and cultural spheres, and to gain access and to influence our elected officials. Here are 4 examples of this united front strategy that Chinese consulates and their proxies have carried out. They have held community press conferences to support the release of Meng Wanzhou and, more clumsily, hire non-ethnic Chinese actors to demonstrate in order to show the mainstream support for their cause. They have compelled Chinese international students to demonstrate against pro-Hong Kong rallies by threatening to withhold their government scholarship or harming their families back home if they don't comply. They cultivated the mayor of a rural British Columbia community for years so that his quote praising China's response on COVID-19 is used on Twitter to burnish China's virus fighting narrative. And finally, they introduced the Confucius Institute, which CSIS has deemed to be a quasi-spying agency, into an Ontario school board by hosting a reception for his chair at Beijing's Great Hall of the People, a venue normally reserved for heads of state. And this wholesale and ongoing influence in our civil society has continued for 30 years as part of China's effort to influence our policies and politics. To dampen or to put a stop on this effort, we should be vigilant against cyber attacks and theft of intellectual property from our corporations and research institutions. 2, provide critical assessment of China's takeover of our corporations in strategic industries such as mining and energy resources, as well as institutions vital to our national security, such as infrastructure and nursing homes. 3, support a national hotline as proposed by Amnesty International to coordinate and to encourage the reporting of China's harassment and intimidation of our own citizens. 4, establish a more stringent process to ensure transparency among current and former elected officials in their relationships with China in order to mitigate undue foreign influence in our internal affairs. 5, coordinate with like-minded allies and join the call for a UN Special Rapporteur on Hong Kong. 6, apply the Magnitsky Act to sanction officials from Hong Kong and China responsible for human rights violations. Finally, this was not in my original script, but I want to share with you a news report that just came in yesterday about the recent global affairs contract to award a Chinese company to install and maintain X-ray scanners in our embassies around the world. Not only did 2 other Canadian companies offer lower bids, but that the Chinese company, Nuntech, was slapped with a 5-year tariff by the EU for alleged dumping and engaging in questionable practices. And recently, the company has been caught setting up a honey trap to scheme a Taiwanese official into purchasing these machines. I will now yield my time to my colleague, A.B. Go.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for having us this afternoon. As mentioned before, apart from being a director of TADC, I'm also a lawyer and the clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, where we provide free legal services to low-income clients, including many refugees from China. But as we speak, the crackdown on pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong is happening right before our eyes. The arrest of Jimmy Lai confirms that no amount of fame and fortune can protect anyone who dares speak out against China's dictatorial regime. But with over 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong and several hundreds of thousands more so Canadians of Hong Kong origin living in Canada, the Canadian government not only have a moral duty to act, but a legal obligation to protect our citizens and their close family members in Hong Kong. Since the Second World War, there have been many examples of Canada granting status to large groups of people fleeing political persecution and civil war. And while the flame of democracy is being suppressed, Hong Kong is burning. And although we may not be able to extinguish the raging fire, we must do what we can to contain its damage and save as many lives as possible. So to that end, we're calling on Canada to take the following actions. First, Canada should expedite family sponsorship applications by Canadians for their families in Hong Kong, including spousal sponsorship as well as sponsorship for parents and grandparents. And Canada should also expand the family class program to facilitate reunification of Canadians with other family members in Hong Kong. Second, as soon as the travel ban is lifted, Canada should issue more temporary resident permits or work visas to Hong Kongers, as well as student visas to young people who want to continue to pursue the study in a safe environment. Third, we should create a special program to grant permanent resident status to the Hong Kong activists involved in the pro-democracy movement and who are already in Canada. Similar to the special program created for the thousands of Chinese nationals present in Canada after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. And finally, for those activists who have been arrested or are in imminent danger of arrest, we should direct the Canadian consulate in Hong Kong to issue temporary resident as well as travel document to facilitate their safe and immediate exit from Hong Kong should they choose to leave. Upon their arrival in Canada, we should provide them with protected person status or permanent resident status. Hong Kong people have stood up against the powerful authoritarian regime to safeguard the core values of democracy and freedom of expression. It's incumbent upon all of us as Canadians to provide our meaningful support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kwan and Ms. Go. Excuse me. Well, I reset my timer, and we'll now proceed to the questions. So the first round is a 6-minute round, and I would ask Mr. Jenis to proceed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And before I get into questions to our excellent witnesses, I just want a couple quick housekeeping things. I want to give other committee members notice of a motion. Quote, that this committee prepare a report on the situation in Hong Kong to be tabled as soon as possible following the completion of hearings looking specifically at the situation in Hong Kong. So that's a notice of motion. I'm not moving it at this time. And I also want to just suggest to you, Mr. Chair, that in light of that notice of motion and a motion that we previously adjourned debate on, that we consider scheduling 20 to 30 minutes to discuss these motions after the witnesses at the end of Monday's meeting. So I'll put that out there for your consideration, the consideration of other members. And now to my questions to the witnesses, thank you for your excellent testimony. It's important that we hear that Magnitsky sanctions is a reoccurring theme, not only in these hearings on Hong Kong, but really across the board. I really appreciated Mr. Rogers' clear statement that the Chinese regime does not respond to statements or rhetoric, that they respond to pressure. And I want to also just single out Mr. Kwan's comments on nuke tech. I think they're so important. That we take a look at what happened here from the government on this nuke tech issue, because given what we're finding out now, it looks like this is either historic stupidity, explicit corruption, or maybe someone here getting caught in some kind of honey trap. It's just so bizarre. It's so hard to explain any other way, and I think we really need to get to the bottom of that. So thank you, Mr. Kwan, for your comments on that. I wanted to drill further now into the immigration, the lifeboat questions, with questions for Ms. Go and Mr. Rogers. So, in the opposition, we've been calling on the government to have and to articulate a plan for helping Canadians who want to leave Hong Kong be able to leave Hong Kong. Because I'm quite concerned that the government of China could take action against Canadians living in Hong Kong. Canadians are well aware of the case of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but one of our witnesses at the last meeting referred to the possibility of, quote, thousands of Michaels being used against Canada, really the escalation of hostage diplomacy on a mass scale if there are efforts to prevent Canadian citizens of other countries, and human rights defenders who might want to claim asylum from being able to leave Hong Kong. And I think we've already seen efforts by the Chinese government to make it more difficult for British nationals to leave in response to the schemes put forward by the British government. So maybe Mr. Rogers, you first. What efforts are we seeing by the Chinese government to prevent foreign nationals from leaving, and what should Canada do to plan for that scenario and be prepared to ensure the security of our citizens?
Well, thank you very much for that very important question. So far, what we have seen is mostly threats by the Chinese government. I'm not aware of concrete steps yet, but certainly the threat to not recognize the British National Overseas Passport, and so that obviously could cause complications for people leaving Hong Kong. So far, a number of people have been able to leave and have come to the UK. I think in the last, since the security law was introduced, at least 60 people, maybe more by now, are in the UK. But there is that threat not to recognize the BNO passport. Of course, there's all sorts of threats against British interests, British companies. They're fairly general threats at the moment. But I think we should brace ourselves for those repercussions. But that is all the more reason why we should be, your country and my country should be trying to help our citizens get out now while they still can.
Thank you very much. So we're seeing threats around the prevention of people leaving, and it seems like that's a real risk of this kind of hostage diplomacy accelerating and growing to include more people. And I see you nodding, Mr. Rogers. So thank you for that. Ms. Go, do you want to weigh in on the same question about, in terms of a lifeboat scheme, what is the likelihood of the Chinese government trying to make it more difficult for us to help people in Hong Kong get out, and what kind of countermeasures should the government be prepared to take?
Right. So for now, if you're a Canadian citizen, chances are you still will be able to get out. But the problem is there are many, for instance, there are some legislative council members in Hong Kong who gave up their Canadian citizenship status in order to run for election. So I'm not sure how the Canadian government will whether or not we will regard them as Canadian citizens anymore is a question. And also, even if they are Canadian citizens, they may have family members who are not either permanent residents or citizens of Hong Kong. So they may not choose to leave at this point, and it may become more difficult for them to leave in the future. My other concern is that Canada may start to impose visa requirements on people from Hong Kong as well, right? So let's say if you're a Canadian citizen living in Hong Kong, but you have family members in Hong Kong, you want to bring them with you to Canada, they may or may not be able to do so unless we have some requirements to allow them. And right now, there's also, on top of everything else, travel ban. So unless you have family members who are spouse and dependent children in Canada, you can't even come to Canada. So there are many layers of problems right now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Goh. Thank you, Mr. Jennis. We'll now go on to Ms. Zan for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much for being here. This is a very serious issue, and it's very concerning about democracy really around the world. I watched a television interview recently with the Apple Daily founder, Jimmy Lai, and he had tears in his eyes as he was talking about his love for his country and also his fears about possibly being arrested, but saying he had to say what he had to say because he was dedicated to the truth and making sure that the truth gets out. And my heart is with him and with his family. He said he has some family members here in Canada. So I'm truly concerned for him and for all other journalists who are being arrested and who are in a state of chill right now in Hong Kong. So several other pro-democracy supporters were also arrested when he was. And the Apple Daily's offices were apparently searched by as many as 200 police officers. So my question is there any particular timing on this? Were they looking for anything in particular, do you think? And how should the international community, including Canada, respond to the arrest of media representatives and student leaders in Hong Kong? Who would like to maybe respond to that? Mr. Davis?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think, of course, the searching of the newsroom was a fishing expedition. I've been told that they're doing a case approach. So the case that explains a lot of the arrests so far is really important to Canada and the United States because it's the case against people who have formed organizations abroad to support Hong Kong. One of those organizations is called Stand With Hong Kong. Another was the Hong Kong Democracy Council. And we're going to have, I think your hearings will include the member of that council who's already the target of an arrest warrant for what he basically lobbying his own Congress, the U.S. Congress. He's an American citizen, Samuel Chu, and his work in the Hong Kong Democracy Council's work was essentially to lobby Congress for the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. So what we're doing right now in this hearing could wind up getting arrest warrants for all of us because under that law, which extends globally, then one of the things they target is the seeking of sanctions against China or Hong Kong by a foreign government. So lobbying to get sanctions, which the questions and answers we're having today might be interpreted accordingly, or even if we say things today that might cause people to hate China, then we also run afoul of that law. And so this hearing is very much in the target of that. And what I think they're doing now is they're using these cases. And so I'm expecting more and more targeting of people who have these organizations abroad that are seeking sanctions and people who testify abroad. Jimmy Lai apparently was a long shot in this, but he's been in there, a target of them for many years as they would view as a great sinner. And his only sin apparently was to provide, allegedly, to provide funding for organizations that lobby governments and parliaments such as yours. So these are things that are basic freedoms that people, even loving their own government, are going to be charged with serious crimes where the punishment is 3 years to life in prison. So this is what's going on.
Can I ask also for any of you, but so when you see the news and you see people on the streets of China, for instance, interviewed, and then they say, well, no, I think this is fine. This is to protect China. This is to protect our society so that we're all one. Can you, any of you, speak to that and how the people on the mainland of China are either receiving a certain type of news? Are they getting mixed news, or are they only getting state news that is telling them one thing?
I will speak to that, Chuck Kwan.
1 minute.
Sorry.
It's okay. 1 minute. Please continue.
I believe that as of July 1st, the Hong Kong people have it worse than the Chinese citizens in mainland China. And this is an anecdote, but this is something very true. In the past, I have not seen as much of the censorship and the self-censorship that's been imposed on Chinese citizens as much as we can see in Hong Kong. I think that this is the grave situation we need to worry about. In my mind, China doesn't care. China will sacrifice Hong Kong. What's 6 million people? When Mao or Deng Xiaoping once said, what's 1 million people killed in a famine? We have 100 billion or whatever it may be. So in that case, I think the callous attitude that China has right now for Hong Kong is equivalent to what they are doing in Eastern Turkestan, in Xinjiang, as well as in Tibet. It almost approaches a cultural genocide.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Zan. We'll now go, second, please. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron, 6 minutes.
Mr. Bergeron, you have 6 minutes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for your testimony. Interesting and illuminating. There'd be so many things to say, so many questions we could ask about the extradition laws and this new measure, the fact that it was adopted, or that the former extradition law wasn't adopted, and that brought in the new law, which was much stronger. This new national security law, its application is even extraterritorial. The fact that local authorities can decide by themselves what constitutes a breach of national security, the common declaration, the treaty between Britain and China on that. There's so many questions that we could discuss, but what I would like to do is piggyback on the line of questioning of Mr. Genus, my colleague, on the way that we can help militants, the way in the Western democracies leave the country, leave Hong Kong. Mr. Genus mentioned the possibility that the Chinese government use hostage diplomacy on a wide scale. We also discussed the possibility that the Chinese government want to prevent people from leaving. So I want to come back to two declarations that seem to be contradicting the part of Mr. Rodriguez. They seem to indicate, on the one hand, that the fact of bringing in militants is a last resort, so that there could be enough people left behind to continue demonstrating in favor of democracy in Hong Kong. And in answer to Mr. Genius, he rather said that we should facilitate the immediate departure of activists while there is still time. So perhaps, Mr. Roger, you could give us a little bit more on this. Should we move quickly to bring in these militants those who risk, which would, on the other hand, allow the Chinese authorities to gain even more authority over Hong Kong, since no one will be protesting. Mr. Rogers.
I fully accept that it's an incredibly difficult dilemma, and that was really what I was trying to illustrate in my statement, is that in principle, this course of action should be a last resort, because we should be trying to do everything possible to prevent the further deterioration of the situation. But on the other hand, as I said in my statement as well, we have to recognize that Hong Kong is now in very grave danger, and there are individuals who are currently in very grave danger. So my direct answer to you is that actually we should be doing both. We should be trying to use whatever tools we have to put pressure on the authorities to stop this erosion of freedoms, but simultaneously those who need to get out now and who might potentially be prevented from doing so if the situation deteriorates further, we should be trying to get them out now. Ultimately, individuals will make their own decisions as to whether they want to stay and continue the struggle or get out. But I think those who do need to get out, I think not only Canada, but the free world should be working together to coordinate a plan to enable them to do so. That might involve for some form of asylum, but it may also involve study and young talent programs and other schemes that together we could come up with. I hope that answers the question.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could ask Madame Go to add to that, if you wish.
Certainly, I totally agree that we should do both at the same time, just as we have been advocating for human rights in China for years, and we will continue to accept refugees from China, those who decide to flee China. So we should do that. And of course, if we do want to allow people from Hong Kong to come here, then sooner rather than later would be better, not only for them, but for us, in part because of the danger that some other witnesses have mentioned about the hostage situation, that, that China holding people Canadians as hostage in Hong Kong. So I think I would certainly urge that we do what is needed to be done now, given there is travel ban, that the consulate has to take immediate action, and even in some cases provide travel document for those whose document has been seized by Hong Kong.
30 seconds.
No. 30 seconds.
Respect à nos témoins.
Well, it would be disrespectful to our witnesses to ask them a question with only 30 seconds, so I return the floor to you. I thank you very much. Mr. Harris, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. It's very difficult to use 6 minutes and respond adequately and ask questions of all of the representations that have been made, and they're quite valuable, and I wish we had a full session with each of you separately. Can I ask, first of all, to Professor Davis a clarification on one of the consequences of the new law? You referred to interference, or sorry, rather with collusion with foreign governments, but my understanding of the law is that it's broader than that, and that it refers to, in fact, collusion with foreign governments or foreign interests. Would you clarify that for me, please, first? And then secondly, if you could tell us whether after the passage of this law from a constitutional perspective, is there any light between or any distinction left between the situation in Hong Kong vis-a-vis the law and what applies in mainland China with respect to security and sedition and these other pieces of obligations? Are we now talking about not two systems, but only one system for the whole country? Professor Davis?
Please unmute, Professor Davis. Unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you. The first question, yes. The answer is yes. It doesn't just apply to reaching out to foreign governments. It can even be aiding and abetting any kind of thing with foreign individuals. I recently testified in Hong Kong before the Law Society, and I could point out to them that I'm a foreign individual, that you guys, there was many pro-Beijing figures in that panel. I said, you guys are in effect colluding with a foreign individual right now, because if I say something that incites hatred towards Hong Kong or China, then you are part of that collusion with me. And unfortunately, this committee could also be tarred with that. When it comes to the mainland national security law versus Hong Kong, oddly, the Hong Kong one in some ways is worse, because the mainland has a kind of principle that its national security law reaches foreign activity only if that foreign activity violates the laws of the country where it takes place. But under the Hong Kong national security law that's been enacted, it doesn't matter that what we're saying here today is not violating Canadian law or American law for those of us sitting in the United States. It still reaches this behavior. So what we're doing, if we actually advocate sanctions at this moment, we could be charged under that law, regardless of the fact that we're exercising our freedom of expression. And I think the other thing is there's a lot of concurrence as well with the mainland system, because these officials now from the mainland are coming actually from the mainland State Security and Public Security Bureau, and there's apparently going to be hundreds of them. And so there's a kind of secret police, and what they say and do is all secret. And even the charges against the people arrested this past week, we really are not clear what the factual predicate is for their charges. We only have rumors based on the questions that were asked to them when they were interrogated. So this secrecy and this idea that officials are above the law and whatever treatment you can have, I didn't mention because I didn't have time, under this new law in Hong Kong, if these security officials from the mainland want to, they can render you to the mainland for trial. So Hong Kongers or a foreigner in Hong Kong, including Canadians who happen to be in Hong Kong, if they're arrested under this law and the mainland officials decide they want to bring you to China to try you, they can do so, which is why, of course, Canada terminated the extradition law.
Thank you. The other question I had for you, perhaps I will end up using my 6 minutes, but in relation to the fact that this is based on the situation with the basic law, the situation of Hong Kong is based on what's been called a treaty. It's been filed in the United Nations treaties. The UK may have some special, or does it have any special means of enforcing that? And does it have any, is it a breach of that treaty, a breach of international law per se, or are we looking at other things like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights?
Well, it's a breach of all of the above. The problem is with the Hong Kong Joint Declaration is there's no provision for resolving disputes. And since China is not acceded to the World Court, the only form of response can be diplomatic, which is one way of resolving international disputes. So that's the case. I would say not just the UK, but also Canada, because all these countries were asked to rely on China's commitments under the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law as a condition of Hong Kong's special treatment. So once China stops adhering to that, they have every reason to complain. This is not purely an internal affair. There's a kind of partnership over how Hong Kong would be treated, and the partnership is being violated.
Well, thank you very much for that clarification, because that gives a strong basis for Canadian action on this with that context of Canada's support for the agreement and its action since that time in treating Hong Kong in a special way. So that's very useful to our committee. I don't know how much time I have, Chair. A little tiny bit.
5 seconds, I'm afraid.
5 seconds. I will leave to the next witness.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to the second round for 5 minutes. Mr. Williamson, please. Please unmute your mic, Mr. Williamson.
Pardon me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have many questions. I'm going to jump right in. Professor Davis, I'm going to try to summarize your testimony and responses. You talked of media raids, liking it to fishing. I would say it left a chilling impact, of course, on other activists and reporters. Rigged election, handpicked judges, a chief executive overseeing the security apparatus, at least outside that of the mainland officials, secret star chambers, the rule of law in Hong Kong being replaced by rule by law or whatever we say from officials in Beijing, and a secret police that sounds an awful like what we saw in East Germany, the Stasi. Can I ask you, should we begin to think of Hong Kong going forward as a quasi Eastern Germany, Poland, Hungary, the Eastern European bloc nations? It's a territory now firmly under the control of Beijing's rule. What say you to that characteristics, looking backwards in time in terms of the threat to the people of Hong Kong?
I would say that's exactly the case. And I hate to say that. As I said, I lived there for 30 years. I'm a Hong Konger. And it pains me to see this, and it's all unnecessary. China's trying to control protest in Hong Kong. All it had to do was listen to Hong Kong people. And this is why I have to stress, and that maybe I go beyond the question slightly, that this is why democracy has been important in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been badly in need of a government that can represent Hong Kong people and voice their concerns. And I think foreign governments should be pushing that line as well.
Thank you.
Can I jump in because and that's
Mrs. Go. I'll come to you in a second. I've got a couple questions here, but I just want to kind of go in order here. But I appreciate your eagerness, Professor Davis, as a legal scholar who knows Hong Kong international law. What would your advice be to this committee and its members? Should we consider holding hearings in Hong Kong? What would your advice be to us as federal lawmakers and our standing in that territory?
My suspicion is if you tried to do so, you'd probably find your visas, your access, your entry stopped if this was publicly known. They've already stopped even like the head of Human Rights Watch, just because he was going to go into Hong Kong and release a report. He was turned around at the airport and sent back. But there's a lot of other things you can do besides hearings in Hong Kong.
No, but that's very interesting. So we're already seeing a chilling impact. I know Mrs. Go has mentioned that, but so we might not even, because currently there are no visa restrictions required for Canadians entering Hong Kong or for Hong Kong citizens coming to Canada. But so we might not get arrested, but we just simply might not be permitted entry.
Yeah, you would be turned around. Yeah. Mr. Kenneth Roth was turned around exactly that way.
Yeah, but your belief is that members who are participating in this committee could well be detained if they ever made it into either mainland China or let's keep it on Hong Kong, where they've had freedoms in the past. We could have said just about anything and been able to travel in and out of the country. That is no longer the case. We could well find ourselves either on trial in Hong Kong or up in mainland China.
Well, there's a danger of that, but even if you don't go to Hong Kong, which I think might be risky, the sanctions that were targeted against individuals in the U.S. went directly to the congressional committee members.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Rogers, very quickly, can I ask, you're located now in the UK. Has your group ever been located in Hong Kong, and would you travel to Hong Kong?
The group has never been located in Hong Kong, but I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover. Yeah. And I meant to say in my testimony earlier, and I omitted it, that I actually was denied entry to Hong Kong in October 2017.
Very
probably
good.
The first of.
I have 15 questions, 15 seconds to ask you. You've mentioned the one country, two systems is kaput. The Sino-British declaration is now null and void. What does this mean for Taiwan?
I think Taiwan is absolutely next if the international community does not act robustly. I've no doubt that the parallel earlier was mentioned about Poland and Czech Republic. I think we're seeing, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Poland. We have to act.
Thank you.
And after Taiwan, we will be next if we don't.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Mr. Williamson, for keeping a close eye on your time. I will now go on to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes.
Thank you all for coming. Your testimony is very important. My question is directed to Mr. Kwan. Over the past year, there have been reports of confrontations in Canada between Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrators and supporters of China's government. What information is available about the nature and frequency of such confrontations? I know you outlined some of it in your opening statement. And also, has there been an increase in confrontations between the two groups since the national security law has been introduced?
I just want to say that every single pro-Hong Kong rally that was peaceful was met with counter-demonstrations organized probably by the Chinese consulates and also a lot of international students or even Canadian residents who are what we call Ferrari driving students who have come up and attempt to perpetuate violence against these pro-Hong Kong rallies. You might have heard that from other groups that have presented before me. So this is an ongoing problem. This is why my testimony today is focused purely on what we can do in Canada. I know that we can talk all we want about what we can do for Hong Kong, but we're going to be met with a stone wall erected by China. And as a proactive way for Canada to move forward, I think we have to protect our citizens. And I want to thank you for bringing this question up because Amnesty International, together with a bunch of our organizations, have issued the harassment report in which Chinese government and Chinese consulates openly harass people like me. And just to point out to the last thing, I have been involved in human rights for the last 30 years. I don't think I'll be transiting through Hong Kong anytime soon, nor will I even want to go to a country that has extradition treaty with China, nor will I fly Cathay Pacific because they have threatened that because Cathay Pacific is a Hong Kong airline registered in Hong Kong, China has a right to adopt me and bring me back to China for trial or whatever it may be. And I want to point out to the famous cases of a couple of years ago when the Hong Kong Causeway Bay bookstores, so one of them is Swedish citizen, one of them is British citizen, were adopted and disappeared from Hong Kong for months without anyone knowing where they are. So this is something that I think is very gravely concerned as Canadians.
There are 600,000 Canadians of Hong Kong descent living in Canada, and I'm sure they share many of your concerns. What can be done to protect those of Canadians with ties to Hong Kong?
I want to defer. Yes. I want to defer this to A.V. Go. I think she's more of an expert in terms of legality of what as a High Commissioner can do in Hong Kong.
Sure, but before I do want to point out that if we start treating Hong Kong as part of China, I'm very concerned that Canada is going to start imposing visa requirements on Hong Kong citizens leaving Hong Kong that will make it far more difficult for people who want to leave Hong Kong now. So I just want to put that out as something that you may, even if you want to consider Hong Kong as part of China, please don't impose that extra barrier for them to leave. For now, I think citizens from Hong Kong, sort of Canadian citizens, they can still come back to Canada for now. It's the family members and the extended family members, as well as people who have no ties with Canada, that I'm most worried about. So, like, even with the last few months, I've been getting calls from people who have family members who may not be, like, because they're Hong Kong citizen, they're not Canadian citizen. Some are their parents, grandparents, so they may not be able to come even during the pandemic travel ban era. So those are the people that we need some kind of immediate action to allow them to come. And maybe we should think about lifting some of the restrictions during the pandemic travel ban, as well as, providing some kind of a facilitating passage for people who are activists but have no current tie with Canada. So those people, if they want to leave, they must be able to find a way to leave.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Gomez and Ms. Yip. Ms. Alislev, 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to also thank all the witnesses for this very important testimony. We are learning incredible things. I want to direct my question, if I could, to Mr. Kwan. You made some recommendations, and one of the recommendations you made was that we need to have a critical assessment of takeovers of Canadian companies, particularly in energy, resources, mining, and other critical infrastructure. I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of why you're making that recommendation, why that situation might be a threat to national security, and what we perhaps should be looking for and what we should do about the results of this critical assessment.
I would just want to give you an example. There was an article by Bloomberg a few weeks ago about documenting how Huawei got to where they are today. They stole technology from Nortel. Yeah. From 20 people that had leaked all the technology, whether as a intentional or not, and they also purchased the rest of the Nortel patent very cheaply off the marketplace. That's because our government at that time of 2008 refused to fund Nortel. So Nortel became a prime target of basically vouchering by other foreign companies. And imagine if China had taken over Nortel and built it up again as a strong Canadian company, its ownership will be in China. And we all know what that means, because as a Chinese company, they have to cooperate with Beijing on any spying activities that might occur. The second one is, of course, from a human rights angle. We have the famous cases of Nexen taken over by Chinese oil company in Alberta. And the concern there was that they would be importing cheap laborers, severely damaging our labor law and also dumping prices out there. In other words, they can be extracting minerals and oil from Canada and selling it off, not at the market price, but at the price that they might decide they want to sell back to Beijing. So these are economic interests and national security interests. And finally, I want to mention this nursing home. I know that you might be surprised that that's part of our national security, because the BC nursing homes have been taken over by Anbang, the biggest insurer in China. And that has created a lot of problems with underpaying staff workers to mistreatment of people who are living in the nursing home. Now, Anbang is also under investigation by China for corruption. So all that adds up into a failed, I don't know what's happening with Anbang right now with the vis-a-vis BC nursing home, but I believe that BC government has now taken back the control of these nursing homes. And these are just very little things that, to China, but to us, this is vital for our security.
And so I just want to clarify, if I could, or ask you to clarify, when you say that if a Chinese company has ownership of a Canadian company here on foreign soil, they still have an obligation to the People's Republic of China government. Could you expand on that a bit and highlight why that's such a national security interest to Canada and that we must be aware of it?
Well, there's a lot of ways they can do it indirectly. They can appoint board of directors, as China has done with South China Morning Post. They have Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, buy up South China Morning Post, appoint the board of directors, pro-China board of directors, and as a result, they have now practically shutting down a once august publication, English language publication in Hong Kong. So they could do that to any Canadian companies. It's a matter of just take over. And it doesn't have to be Chinese citizens. It could be Canadian citizens who might be pro-China or would have a sympathetic to Chinese requirement. And these are what I call very national security and economic interest that is in jeopardy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kwan and Ms. Oleslev. Et maintenant, Monsieur Dubourg.
Mr. Dubourg, you have 5 minutes. Here we are. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would first like to thank all the witnesses with us today, virtually. Don't forget to go on the interpretation channel to hear my questions. My first question will be for Ms. Go. You are here in Canada, and I want to know this. With this new national security law, which applies outside of the Chinese territory, other witnesses this week who are pro-democracy have appeared before our committee. And do you believe that these activists are protected by Canada? You've talked about cyberbullying and other threats. Do you believe that what CSIS or the RCMP have put in place will sufficiently protect the basic freedom, which is so dear to us in Canada, against the influence and interference of China?
Of understanding, there are two ways to understand that question. One is influence and interference, which Mr. Kwan talked about. So that goes towards the interfering the political system and the economic system in Canada. With respect to protection, so I was born in Hong Kong, but I'm a Canadian citizen. I don't have my Hong Kong citizen anymore. I feel secure, at least for now, in Canada, but I will never go to Hong Kong. And just like what Mr. Kwan has said, I would not go to Thailand or any other countries that may have an extradition treaty with China, or even if they don't, they may send some of us back to China for a while they want to have on us. So I'm only secure to the extent that when I'm protected by the Canadian system. But that protection, I hope, can be extended now to some of the people in Hong Kong who don't have that luxury and the protection that I have. And I'm hoping that Canada will facilitate their entry to Canada.
D'accord, merci.
Thank you. There was mention of the Magnitsky Act and other measures. Do you believe that Canada should impose more sanctions? And since I have very little time left, I will ask you right away, what is the impact of the fact that the legislative elections have been put off?
So I think that Canada should certainly do more, applying the Magnitsky Act, and to hold the accountable Hong Kong and China officials who are implicated and directly involved in human rights violations. And I think that needs to be done. And I think a lot of the NGOs are there to provide help government to come up with a list if you do want that list. And with respect to the election, I think it's just another way of stifling, the pro-democracy and the freedom of expression in Hong Kong. Because if they were to hold the election today, I think the pro-democracy movement probably will still prevail, notwithstanding the national security law. However, with a year from now, that may not be the case, because by then the impact of the NSL would be much more severely felt, and people will probably not be able to. Well, first of all, most of the pro-democracy candidates will have been disqualified. But even for those who remain, I think a lot of Hong Kong people may be afraid to elect who they really want.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Dubourg. Mr. Bergeron, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to get back to a question that was raised a little earlier concerning the common statement. The Chinese government says it's only a statement, purely symbolic, whereas the UK believes it's a statute registered with the United Nations. What is the legal weight of this treaty vis-à-vis the national security law, and how can it be used for the pro-democracy movement who wants to get involved in the pro-democracy cause and go against China, who believes that these are purely internal matters concerning China? This is for Mr. Davis and Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. Do you want to go first, Benedict, or me? I'll go ahead then.
Please go ahead.
I don't hear you. Yes, the Joint Declaration is a treaty. It was registered with the United Nations as a treaty. Both China and Britain treated it as a treaty. So I think that there's no question about that. China tried earlier to declare that this treaty was no longer valid, that once Hong Kong was returned, there was no cause for it. But if you look in Article 7 of the Joint Declaration, you see it expressly says that both parties are obliged to carry out all of its terms until the 50 years have ended. So there's no legal dispute as to that. I think more importantly, Canada and Britain and the United States and all the countries with Hong Kong separately have been invited. Chinese officials went to your capitals and asked for you to treat Hong Kong distinctly. So beyond the treaty, there's this kind of I call it a partnership, a kind of arrangement that all these countries would give Hong Kong special status, which has worked very much to China's advantage. 2/3 of the companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange are mainland companies. The mainland has used this as a way to gain international investments and a way to make them. So the reliance is very substantial by Canada, by the United States, and so on. So you have both a treaty and an invitation to rely on the commitments in the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law.
Malheureusement, je regrette qu'on n'a pas.
I'm sorry, but there won't be time for Mr. Rogers to answer. Maybe a little later. Thank you.
And now we go on to Mr. Harris for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Kwan, first of all, let me say thank you very much for your 30 years of championing human rights and for bringing to the attention of this committee the activities of China within Canada. The urgent attention, I think, is something that Canada ought to take in hand immediately, and hopefully we will be recommending that. I wanted to ask Ms. Goh to, have I got it right, the efforts that we ought to be making in the immigration field that would help right now? First of all, expanding family reunification categories to spouses, not only to spouses, but also to parents and children and other relatives. Secondly, extending existing visas for students and those already in Canada, offering more student and working visas to residents of Hong Kong, ensuring that there's a continued free visa admission from visa-free admission from Hong Kong residents, and lastly, to facilitate safe exit by perhaps offering travel documents to those who require them because they've been confiscated. Have I got the complete picture here, or am I leaving something out? And would you like to elaborate on any individual one of them?
Just one clarification for the people who are in Canada right now, because there are at least about 50 people from Hong Kong claiming refugee status.
Oh, yes.
So I'm suggesting that, just grant them permanent resident status, just as we had a program for the Chinese nationals after the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Thank you. That's an important addition. Okay. What about? Is there? We don't normally accept refugees except already being in Canada, or unless you're already declared an international refugee. So what? Is there anything on that score that you would like to comment on?
Yeah, unfortunately, sort of like UNHCR, let's say UNHCR has an office in Hong Kong, but they will not be taking in Hong Kong refugees, right? So they will be, but then in the neighboring countries, UNHCR, people will have to go there first to make a claim through UNHCR before they will be resettled in Canada. So it's very cumbersome and it's very difficult. That's why I think if we want to help, we should provide a more direct route just through the consulate for the people in Hong Kong to try to help them find a way out. It may or may not be possible, and it may not be able to work for all of them, but for some of them who want to leave, at least we should give it a try.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Goh. Thank you, Mr. Harris. This concludes the time we have available for the first panel today. And so I know that all members deeply appreciate your willingness, I say this to the witnesses, of course, to come before us today and their testimony. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll now suspend for 5 minutes or so until we set up for the next panel. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
welcome back. Before, let me just go through a few organizational things before we go ahead. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. Having said that, once we get to the questions from members, I'll ask the members to direct who they wish to answer their questions, and you needn't during that period, during the period of each member, to wait. You didn't wait for me to call on you then. Interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Please, a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. As you are speaking, if you plan to alternate from one language to the other, you will need to also switch the interpretation channel so it aligns with the language you are speaking. You may want to allow for a short pause when switching languages. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. I would now like to welcome our second panel of witnesses. From Freedom House, Annie Boyajian, Director of Advocacy. From the Hong Kong Democracy Council, Samuel M. Chu, Founding and Managing Director. From the New York University School of Law, Jerome A. Cohen, Professor and Faculty Director Emeritus, U.S. Asia Law Institute. Each witness organization will have up to 10 minutes to make an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from members. So now we'll start with the Freedom House, Ms. Boyajian, and pardon me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please go ahead.
You nailed
for
it.
10 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It is an honor to participate in today's meeting. Thank you for your attention to the important matter of deteriorating freedom in Hong Kong. I am Director of Advocacy at Freedom House, a nonpartisan, independent watchdog organization dedicated to the expansion of freedom and democracy around the world. We provide research and analysis on the state of political rights and civil liberties, undertake advocacy on key issues impacting democracy, and carry out international programmatic work to strengthen democratic institutions and civil society capacity. Our work on China-related issues includes tracking the status of rights and freedoms in our annual publications, special reports on Hong Kong, on Beijing's global media influence, and on the repression of religious groups in China, and advocacy work on all of these issues, including vocal support for the imposition of sanctions on officials involved in rights abuses in Hong Kong and mainland China. As you may have seen, this work landed Freedom House on a list of organizations sanctioned by Beijing last December. We were not deterred, and our continued focus on the rapidly deteriorating rights situation in Hong Kong resulted in Freedom House President Mike Abramowitz being one of 11 Americans sanctioned just this week by the Chinese Communist Party for, quote, bad behavior related to Hong Kong. The inconvenience these sanctions pose to Freedom House staff pales in comparison to the sacrifices made by those in Hong Kong and mainland China seeking to protect and promote rights and freedoms. It is our honor to stand with them. Freedom House has tracked a decline in democracy and human rights conditions in Hong Kong over the last decade, alongside increasing interference by the Chinese government. This decline stems from worsening repression in China as a whole, as Xi Jinping has intensified efforts to exert control both at home and abroad. Our freedom in the world scores for both mainland China and Hong Kong have never been lower. The one country, two systems framework worked out before the 1997 handover was, as you know, supposed to guarantee autonomy and protection of rights in Hong Kong until 2047. Of course, this is not what has happened in practice. The CCP began tightening control in Hong Kong long before 2047. The current protest movement, which I must point out was entirely initiated by the people of Hong Kong and is completely citizen-led, began last March and is bigger and more intense than past pro-democracy demonstrations there. Protesters have faced violence from police and pro-Beijing thugs. Some have reported mistreatment and detention, including sexual abuse, and many have raised concerns about mysterious supposed suicides of protesters. Unable to silence the justified and growing unrest in Hong Kong, Beijing effectively terminated the one country, two systems model by imposing the sweeping new national security law. As you know, this law effectively criminalizes dissent by anyone in the world, anywhere in the world. Since the law took effect on June 30th, we are witnessing the transformation of Hong Kong into an authoritarian state at breakneck speed. So why should anyone in Canada care about repression in Hong Kong, especially given all that's going on in the world? There are the economic and security arguments. Hong Kong is home to 300,000 Canadians. It is Canada's third largest market for the export of services and 13th largest market for the export of merchandise, which together totaled $5.1 billion in 2017. But what is probably most compelling to the public is the fact that CCP repression in Hong Kong is directly impacting what people are able to do in their daily lives, even in Canada. Canadians living in Hong Kong are, of course, at risk of arrest. They may also fall victim to politically motivated arrests besides just national security law issues, as we have seen happen in mainland China. You are, of course, well aware of the cases of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spadmore. Perhaps less well known is the case of Sun Qian, a Canadian citizen just sentenced in Beijing to 8 years in prison for being a Falun Gong practitioner. It is possible that these types of arrests could now also occur in Hong Kong. Repression in Hong Kong poses a direct threat to those living in Canada, too. The CCP is well known for targeting dissidents and critics living abroad. As you heard on Tuesday, the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China and Amnesty International Canada did a wonderful report on the harassment and intimidation faced by individuals in Canada working on China human rights issues. The report found that advocates across Canada are increasingly facing threats, intimidation, and harassment for their work on human rights in China. The report also noted that many of these incidents are occurring on university campuses and in secondary schools. We see similar tactics in the US. Hong Kong's national security law takes the risks of intimidation and surveillance a step further. It criminalizes provoking hatred toward the Chinese and Hong Kong governments or colluding with foreign powers. Anyone deemed guilty of subverting state powers or inciting secession could face life in prison. It even applies to actions undertaken outside the region by people who are not even permanent residents of the region. This means anyone in Canada speaking out against repression in Hong Kong could face arrest. Samuel Chu, an American citizen, faces precisely this scenario. You will hear from him next, and I will let him tell his own story. But the fact that he, as an American citizen, is wanted for arrest in Hong Kong due to advocacy work done in the US signals just how far the CCP is attempting to extend repression. There are also reports that Hong Kong authorities are seeking Jimmy Lai's American assistant, Mark Simon. Mr. Chu and Mr. Simon would both risk arrest and possibly decades behind bars were they to travel to any country that might extradite them to mainland China or Hong Kong. Repression in Hong Kong also impacts the information available to Canadians, the products and services they purchase, and the news and entertainment they consume. Many scholars and politicians in Hong Kong have served as important sources of information for policymakers and academics around the world, not just about what is happening in Hong Kong, but also about what is occurring in mainland China and elsewhere in Asia. Many of these voices are no longer accessible. Prominent academics, activists, journalists, and political candidates have been arrested in recent weeks. Others have been scared into silence. Political groups and advocacy coalitions have disbanded, removing reports and materials from the web, deleting social media accounts, changing phone numbers and email addresses. We do not yet know the long-term impacts of this loss of critical information, but it is not insignificant. Hong Kong has also emerged as a new CCP red line for international corporations, which have come under pressure to censor their own communications and products. Air Canada, the Royal Bank, and Canadian multinationals like Apple, Amazon, Siemens have all been accused by the CCP of supposedly listing Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan incorrectly on their websites and have faced enormous pressure to modify their websites accordingly. In October 2019, the National Basketball Association found itself in hot water after Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." Chinese officials expressed outrage. The Chinese Basketball Association cut ties with the Rockets, and Chinese state television refused to air Rockets games. The NBA and various players quickly apologized and distanced themselves from the tweet, which in turn sparked criticism from groups like ours, which objected to the NBA's failure to defend free speech. Hundreds showed up at NBA games to protest, including about 300 people wearing Stand with Hong Kong t-shirts at the Toronto Raptors season opener. Elsewhere, pro-democracy protesters were ejected from games or had their signs confiscated for holding up slogans as benign as Google Uyghurs. Canadian media has also been impacted by repression in Hong Kong and mainland China. Over the past decade, top CCP officials have overseen a dramatic expansion in efforts to influence public debate and media coverage around the world, including pressuring newsrooms to censor content critical of the regime. 2 journalists at Canada's Global Chinese Press were fired in 2016 and 2017 after publishing content deemed displeasing to Beijing. CCP repression is even making its way into living rooms across Canada via Chinese state-run television. Despite a 2006 ruling by the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission that CCTV4 could continue to operate in Canada only if it remained in compliance with broadcasting regulations, both CCTV4 and CGTN have broadcast false information about Hong Kong protests and the detention of Uyghurs, and about 30 forced confessions, all viewable by anyone in Canada who tunes into these stations. We at Freedom House are often told that although repression in Hong Kong is terrible, it doesn't impact us here. But that's just not true. CCP repression is already shaping what we can say, where we can travel, the products we buy, even the news we read. It's bad enough that the CCP routinely breaks Chinese laws and international commitments by violating the rights of people in mainland China and Hong Kong. The regime certainly should not be permitted to do so in Canada. I look forward to sharing specific recommendations during the question and answer time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Boyajan. And now we'll hear from Mr. Chu for up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair and committee, and thank you for having me. And I am the Managing Director for Hong Kong Democracy Council, HKDC, that is based in Washington, D.C. We are the first U.S.-based organizations advocating on behalf of Hong Kong's autonomy and basic freedoms that is led by U.S. citizens, where our mission is focused on influencing and informing U.S. policy towards Hong Kong and China. And I want to make that clear up front because on July 30th, I went to bed and woke up the next morning with notification and media reports that I am now a wanted felon, or at least a wanted fugitive. Chinese media has leaked a report on July 30th that the Hong Kong authorities and police have issued arrest warrant for 6 pro-democracy activists who are promoting democracy for Hong Kong that are currently overseas. I was one of the 6, and the charges were inciting secessions and colluding with foreign powers. This was part of the national security law that was concocted by Beijing in secret and then rolled out on July 1st and implemented at the same time that it was made public for the very first time. Both of the crimes that I am allegedly accused of are punishable by life in prison. Except I am different from the others who are on the list and others who have experienced and encounters harassment and arrest in Hong Kong since the implementation of the law. I have been American citizen for 25 years. I left Hong Kong and arrived in Los Angeles, California in 1990. Except that the national security law in provision in Article 38 states specifically that this law shall apply to offenses under this law committed against Hong Kong Special Administrative Region from outside the region by a person who is not a permanent resident of the region. So in other words, every provisions of the national security law applies to everyone outside of Hong Kong. Nobody is beyond the law's reach. Not me as a U.S. citizen on American soil, not the 8,500 or 1,000 Americans who are living and working in Hong Kong, and not the estimated 200 or 250,000 Canadian citizens who are living and working in Hong Kong itself. My surprising status as an international fugitive illustrates the imminent threat to freedom and free expression that not only Hong Kong pro-democracy activists are experiencing and have been experiencing, but we have been warning over the past year that are coming to not just American soil, but in Canada. Since the implementation of the national security law, we have already seen the direct impact it has in crackdowns in Hong Kong, specifically around the rights of free speech, of free press, free assembly and protests. The first arrest made under the national security law in Hong Kong was of a young person who was wearing a t-shirt that says Free Hong Kong. Authorities have also targeted a 19-year-old protester whose crime was simply having a sticker on the back of his phone that has the word conscience written in Chinese. In the following days, the government had disqualified 12 separate pro-democracy candidates from the electoral election that the government eventually postponed for a year. Benny Tai, who is a professor who was a co-founder with my father of the Umbrella Movement in 2014, was then ousted in his job and as a tenured professor at Hong Kong University. 4 young protesters were arrested for online posting that the government claims were inciting secessions. And schools have now banned the use of slogans and the singing of the protest anthem, Glory to Hong Kong, in all schools. As the assault on basic freedoms, and as Ms. Boyer-Jane pointed out, has been happening, Americans and Canadians and folks in Western countries have been watching from afar, from a safe distance. With social solidarity through social media, through our solidarity protest and rally. But now, as my experience have shown, you don't have to be in Hong Kong for you to be in trouble with the Chinese regime and the Hong Kong government. Simply tweeting or your retweet of someone else's tweet could earn you an arrest warrant and a prison sentence. Article 38, as presented, as written, can seem very outlandish and impractical and unenforceable. But the impact is not just in what it can do and not do legally, but the design of the law is to create a chilling effect, a threat that essentially threaten and try to implicate anyone and everyone who's not just directly speaking out for Hong Kong, but also connected to people who are speaking out to Hong Kong. In my case, for example, I can no longer travel to Hong Kong or any countries with any active extradition treaties with Hong Kong or China, or any countries that have friendly relations with China without risking arrest and almost certain extradition to mainland. I cannot speak to my elderly parents in Hong Kong without opening them and subjecting them to investigation and invasive searches by the police. Even anyone who is in contact with me, who are here, who are not in Hong Kong, could be blacklisted by Chinese government, by Chinese-backed financial interests, whose influence are vast and extend deep from the Hollywoods to NBA to Apple to Zoom, which we're using right now for this meeting. I might be the first to be targeted as a foreign citizen under the national security law, but I will not be the last. Because if I can be targeted, then anyone who speaks on behalf of Hong Kong, who speaks out against the CCP, can also be targeted. As I said in my introductions, I am a second-generation pro-democracy advocates. Only about 18 months ago, I was in Hong Kong attending the trial of my father, the Reverend Chu Yu-ming, who was arrested and then charged for his role in inciting, quote unquote, the protests of the 2014 Umbrella Movement. He, along with 8 others, were convicted of charges. He was sentenced for 2 years. Unfortunately, because of his age and health problems, his sentence was suspended. But this has been happening and will continue to escalate quicker and broader. Tiananmen Square in '89 was a movement that my father supported and helped to build the Underground Railroad that smuggled dissidents out of China into Western countries. I was sent away as part of considerations anticipating the risk that was involved in building that operations and being a part of that movement. But that crackdown has happened every day since June 4th, 1989. It has spread rapidly now in Hong Kong since July 1st. And since 2 weeks ago, it has spread to American soil, and it will soon and already are on Canadian soil. Human rights might not have been a priority in US policies towards China a year ago, but you can be assured that human rights and control of human rights and the violation of human rights is the top priority of the Chinese regime. Because without it, they lose control of their government, and they lose control that they're trying so hard to implement, not just in mainland, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, but also in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and now in Western nations. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chu. Now, Professor Cohen, please, for up to 10 minutes. Professor Cohen, please unmute your mic. I'm afraid you. Okay, thank you.
We have just heard two wonderful reports, and let me try to supplement what has been said. I don't know what the three witnesses told you in the first session this morning, but it seemed to me you've probably heard 5 first-class statements already. I want to point out of the 3 witnesses this afternoon, I represent organizations that have not yet been punished by the national security law, but I suppose we have good prospects. I've been happy in the past to cooperate with Freedom House and with the new Hong Kong Democracy Council, and perhaps I can rely, as Samuel's father has, on old age as a defense against actual imprisonment, but I can't guarantee anything about conviction. Well, let me give some perspective. I first went to Hong Kong in 1961. I lived there 62-3. I've been a frequent visitor, and I lived there again beginning 79. I've seen Hong Kong's connection to China develop over many years. Initially, in the 60s, in the early part of the decade, Hong Kong was a classic British colony. To be sure, it was controlled by the colonial authorities, including the special branch of the police, and there were no conventional democratic freedoms. People couldn't elect their own government. But Hong Kong, despite its severe social and economic problems of the era, which were largely the product of events in China, because the starvation of tens of millions of people in China at the end of the 50s as a result of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, and the political repression that began again in 1957-58 in the so-called anti-rightist movement, sent many people to the doors of Hong Kong. And in April, May 62, 60,000 people crossed the border from Guangdong province to Hong Kong before the British finally had to close it, because there would have been hundreds of thousands of people who were waiting on the other side. So Hong Kong had enormous problems then, but it was essentially a free society. I could say what I wanted. The Brits thought that my study of China from a base in Hong Kong suggested maybe I was a CIA agent or something, but they were very discreet. Nobody ever tried to stop me from setting up a research institute there. I could say what I wanted, and other people could say what they wanted. So Hong Kong, while not a bastion of liberal democracy, still was a liberal society with many troubles at that point. Of course, as a result of the Cultural Revolution in China in the late 60s, Hong Kong went through a terrible period of turmoil. The police had to be very active, and by and large, they had popular support. And that's a very important thing to understand. The police had popular support. When I went back to live in Hong Kong, beginning 79, it was a different place. Deng Xiaoping had brought China to a different place. He had presented hope to the people of China and Hong Kong. And as a result, the 80s were a dynamic, optimistic, increasingly prosperous time in Hong Kong. And you had 1984 marking the joint declaration between the UK and China for Hong Kong's future handover in 1997. But everything changed, as Samuel's remarks remind us, with Tiananmen, June 4th, 1989, the horrific slaughter near Tiananmen Square and other suppression throughout China. That made it more important to try to adapt the basic law that was to come out the next year to the new fear that was marking Hong Kong's population, and only limited impact was made on the new law. But when Chris Patten became the last governor of Hong Kong's colonial rule, he spent 5 years trying to prepare Hong Kong by guaranteeing people greater political freedoms and protection of human rights, all over the opposition of the pro-Beijing forces in Hong Kong and of the People's Republic government in Beijing. And that's why he was denounced in such terrible terms by the Beijing government. Well, since the handover in 97, we have seen a progressive narrowing of freedoms in Hong Kong, increasing control of the Hong Kong government as the, you might say, instrument of the People's Republic in Beijing rather than the representative of the people of Hong Kong, culminating last year in the enormous popular protest, a couple of million people at one point, against the attempt to provide for extradition, rendition from Hong Kong to China of people wanted by the central government for trial. It's remarkable, although the People's Republic has managed to make, I think, over 40 extradition agreements with other countries. None of the Anglo-American common law countries has ever ratified an extradition agreement with China. Australia came close. And the fact is, Hong Kong has never had a similar agreement with its own central government because the people of Hong Kong have long known there is only political justice in the mainland under the communist regime. And that's what they feared, that's what they fought back. But now the new national security law, as you know, has brought extradition to Hong Kong. Indeed, it's brought the whole administration of criminal justice from the mainland to Hong Kong. You don't have to be extradited now to be under the control of the security police of the mainland government. They've come to Hong Kong. That's the principal accomplishment of the national security law. You ought to know Hong Kong has had national security laws inherited from the British colonial period and hasn't hesitated to invoke them. So it's nonsense to say everyone else has a national security law. Why shouldn't we? And of course, national security laws have different content. The content of this one is to install a repressive regime. And the central government security authorities will decide whether they want to transport Jimmy Lai and even Samuel Chu if they can get their hands on him. Not only try them in Hong Kong, but to transfer them to the mainland for long incommunicado detention, potential torture, denial of access to counsel, inability to meet with family or friends, and then trial before a communist-dominated court. And if you're tried in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong vaunted independent legal system has been truncated by the new law. So national security offenses are going to be tried before special judges and without a jury. And if you think you can challenge it by saying you misinterpreted the law, it's too broad, or you don't understand it's unconstitutional given Hong Kong's constitutional background and heritage, that question will be because of Hong Kong, even the Court of Final Appeal. That question will be decided by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. So Hong Kong is a very different place from what it was in 1997 and what it was when I first got there in 1961.
Thank you very much, Professor. We'll now go to the first round of questions, starting with Mr. Williamson for 6 minutes. Mr. Williamson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to all of our witnesses. It is very enlightening to hear from all of you today, and I'm glad that you are able to join us and share your knowledge and expertise. I've got 6 minutes. I'm going to try to spend a few minutes with each of you. I'll ask you to keep your questions or your answers, pardon me, as brief as possible. Professor Cohen, could I start with you? First of all, thank you for that brief political history of the territory of Hong Kong, pre and post handover, pre, during, and then post handover. Could I ask you to explain a term very briefly so everyone is clear? You referred to justice in mainland China as political justice. You don't mean justice by the ballot box there, do you? What is political justice, just so we're clear on terminology here? And that's for Professor Cohen.
Professor Cohen, I think your screen is frozen for a moment. Oh. It appears. So would you like to go to someone else, Mr. Williamson? Sorry about that.
I will. I'll come back to Professor Cohen. And Chair, I hope you'll indulge me and allow me to reset my time here. So since we have a technical issue. Mr. Chu, I'm going to say a few statements. In your opinion, have I now violated China's Beijing's national security law, making me a potential problem for the PRC?
So the screen froze, I think, from your end for a second. So you're having a lot of difficulty technically. So I only got the very last part, but I assume if you can repeat just the first part of what
I support a democratic China. I believe the PRC should embrace democracy. Welcome
to the club of international fugitives.
Yeah.
And I think that you're demonstrating. I mean, we sort of are half joking, but I did really. I think the implication here is that having this hearing, talking about any kind of Canadian policy towards Hong Kong and China that involves sanctions over human rights violation, particularly, is apparently something that will trigger. And I think in your case, it might start with sanction, but it definitely, under the national security law, would subject you to arrest.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, I regret that you, unless things change, will not be able to visit your ancestral home again, and nor potentially even talk to your grandparents. I had the pleasure of living in Hong Kong during the handover, 97, 98, and I have both experienced the freedoms there, both initially under the colonial rule as well as under the Sino-British agreement in the basic law. And it is clear that much has changed owing to Beijing's heavy-handedness. Professor Cohen, are you with us again? Okay, I'll come back to you last. Miss Boyanjian, I probably have not pronounced that right, but pardon me. Could I ask you, if you were an advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's foreign affairs advisor, what are some of the things that you would recommend the Canadian government do, both to aid the people of Hong Kong and as well prepare to safeguard the freedoms that are currently enjoyed in Taiwan or the Republic of China?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So I think it's critical for Prime Minister Trudeau to impose meaningful penalties on Chinese and Hong Kong officials who have committed rights violations. We have already seen this be very effective in the United States. Their prickly response can tell you how effective it was. And that response would be all the stronger if Canada would deploy the Canadian version of the Magnitsky Law. I think it's also critical to conduct a careful review of imports and exports. Anything coming from mainland China or Hong Kong made with slave labor should be prohibited. In the US, we have something that is currently pending called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that creates a rebuttable presumption, meaning if it's coming from Xinjiang, we assume it's made with slave labor and companies have to prove otherwise. That sort of model would be an excellent model. We also think it's critical to mitigate, prepare for, and respond to the risks that face Canadians in Hong Kong, but also Canadians who live in Canada working on human rights issues. So if we start to see politically motivated arrests in Hong Kong, be ready to evacuate people quickly, insist that they have consular access and that they'd be protected from torture. I think it's also very important, now that information is cut off, that you continue to seek information from actual Hong Kongers. And there are some great diaspora groups. I commend you all for bringing so many excellent diaspora folks to the committee already, but I have been asked by Hong Kongers to convey to you excellent work from the Canadian Friends of Hong Kong. I'm told they have a deep understanding of CCP infiltration in Canada. And then lastly, since I know I'm using your time, I think it's critical for the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission to go ahead and conduct that review of whether CCTV and CGTN have violated operations, and transparency requirements for Chinese media would be good as well.
Thank you. And are you able to speak to Taiwan at all? Is that in your bailiwick?
So for Taiwan, I'm sure Professor Cohen will have more to say, but we are concerned. I heard the previous panel say that we think it is next. And so things like the Chinese government trying to bully Taiwan out of multilateral institutions, as we've seen with the World Health Organization, for example, we should respond forcefully to that and not allow that kind of thing to happen.
Thank you very much, Ms. Boyajian and Mr. Williamson. Mr.
So
Williamson,
just a point.
I think you'll see that I did adjust your time a bit. I think you're timing it yourself, I believe, and so I did try to add some time. I hope it's.
It looks like I'm down 50 seconds before you started to talk here. So.
Well, I don't think so, but at any rate, I do have, of course, to make sure that all members have their chance to ask their questions and get the time they have, and so I'm trying to manage all that. And I don't think we have Professor Cohen back yet, but hopefully we will shortly, just for the benefit of witnesses. And now we go on to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses. I believe Mr. Cohen said earlier that we have had some pretty exceptional witnesses today. And again, I want to, thank the clerk and the analysts for organizing this in such a thoughtful way. I want to begin with Freedom House and Ms. Boyajian. I'm a big fan and use your scoreboards, your scorecards, and your ratings extensively in my work in Africa and around the world. And so thank you. Noting the sanction that has been placed on your president, Abramovich, has this ever happened before? Has a country sanctioned you or your organization before for this activity?
This is the first time Freedom House and the first time Mr. Brumwitz has been sanctioned. Those sanctions are unspecified. As I mentioned, last December, we were slapped with organizational sanctions by the CCP, and there were several other American organizations as well: Human Rights Watch, National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, and DI.
Thank you. And I've been watching the sanction kind of ping pong going on with China, Beijing sanctioning 11 American citizens, and then Mr. Trump sanctioning 11 Chinese. It's going back and forth. Those sanctions that have been imposed by Mr. Trump, do they have teeth? Are they going to work, or would it be more appropriate to have those done multilaterally because of where people actually hold their assets and what could actually be done? What would your recommendation be?
Multilateral is always better. The more countries that do it, the better. But these are very effective targeted sanctions. Similar to your own Magnitsky law, it blocks visas of the sanctioned individuals so they cannot come to the U.S., but it also freezes any U.S.-based assets they have. But what is critical to this being so effective is that countries around the world look to U.S. Department of Justice and Department of Treasury and U.S. financial institutions. And if we put a freeze order, what we often see is a domino effect around the world that EU states, the UK, others won't allow those individuals access to any funds they have in their accounts as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's something we're going to have to very much consider in this committee. Mr. Chu, thank you for your ongoing work and your courage, and thank you for being with us today. I'm looking at the effects, the extraterritorial effects of the National Security Act, and obviously we're beginning to see how that plays out. And you mentioned yourself the restrictions on you to travel to Hong Kong, your concerns about talking to your parents, and also your concerns about traveling to countries that have ongoing extradition agreements with China. How do you find out that information about where those extradition agreements are and whether they would be affected or not, whether they would actually take place?
Yeah. So HKDC has been part of a much larger global coalition that has been pushing, and we thank the Prime Minister's government for suspending the extradition treaty between Canada and Hong Kong. I think that this is where, again, I think the design of it is to have this dark cloud, because actually there is not a lot of clarity in a lot of regions and countries who does not spell out specifically. In the case of the U.S., for example, even within the extradition treaty, the U.S. treaty with Hong Kong had very specific wording and language that says that any politically motivated charges would not be recognized or accepted, and that extradition to Hong Kong should never be used as a vehicle for another country, in this case, the Chinese government, to do extradition via Hong Kong as an entity. And so I think that in the US and I think in Canada, there are some very clear, defined parameters and mechanism. That is not the case in many, many countries. So I actually don't know for sure which countries and which, even if they don't have an extradition regime, treaty, if that would actually be something that could happen to me if I just transferred.
Thank you. I think I have a few seconds left. And Mr. Chair, through you, I would like some help from our analysts in the next while around that question of extradition and around how we could warn Canadians perhaps about travel to other countries and what would be effective. I have 1 minute left. So Mr. Cohen, I just wanted to ask you, I read about your work with the 4 Cs around cooperation and what we could be doing with respect to that. The environment has changed. Even in weeks, that environment has changed. Are there areas still that you've got containment, we've got a challenge, we've got to do these things? Are there areas that we would still have cooperation, or is that era gone?
In 20 seconds, please. Sorry, and please unmute.
That era has not passed. Those are good questions, but Canada certainly is very near the Arctic. Canada needs a good environment. Canada needs to prevent against pollution. We need to have cooperation with respect to military weapons.
Professor, thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we are over Mr. Oliphant's time. And just a second, please. Et maintenant, je vais tourner à Monsieur.
It's over to Mr. Bergeron. You have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I invite the witnesses to ensure that they're listening to their English channel in order to get the interpretation, in order to be able to understand the questions I will be putting to them in French. Thank you, first off, for your important contribution to the work of our committee. We seek to work in depth on Canada-Chinese relationships, and obviously the issue of Hong Kong is of capital importance to us, not only, as Mr. Williamson pointed out, because it has possible future effects on Taiwan, but also because Canada is a member of the Commonwealth, and we're therefore concerned about the violation by the Chinese government of the Common Declaration. And also because Canada has seen some of its own sons die on Hong Kong soil during the Japanese invasion, Second World War, and therefore the issues related to Hong Kong are of concern to us, and that is why we're having a close look at the situation in Hong Kong currently. We saw during the health crisis, the pandemic, that there were criticisms within the Popular Republic about Xi Jinping, who is the President and Secretary General of the Communist Party, who has reached the highest level of power since Mao Zedong. And so we're asking ourselves some questions. For those of you who may have heard the first session this morning of our meeting today, there were questions about bringing in militants. Will we be weakening the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong if we take in a lot of militants here? And also there's the issue of sanctions. Several think that sanctions could have as an effect the weakening of Xi Jinping's grasp on the Democratic Republic of China and the Chinese people, where others think that it might raise up the nationalist sentiment in China and therefore give even more power to Xi Jinping on the Chinese Democratic Republic of China. So I'd like to hear you, but perhaps Mrs. Boyachin first on this dilemma. Question, will sanctions have just as much bad effect as good effects? Given the objectives that Western democracies might have with regard to Hong Kong?
I think if China is looking to de-escalate tensions, a great way to do that is to start following their own domestic laws and international commitments that they have already agreed to. I think sanctions is always something that needs to be weighed carefully. And in this case, this is why Freedom House and others have advocated carefully place sanctions on the individuals who are guilty for actual abuses. And so it's not wide-scale sanctions that would hurt the Chinese people. So I think that's critical to remember.
Je ne sais pas si Monsieur Chu.
Mr. Chu or Mr. Cohen, would you like to join in?
Yes, I'd like to say something. Sanctions are a symbol, and even if largely ineffectual, they do symbolize our detestation for what is taking place. We live by symbols. But of course, they can backfire, and they're not very effective because we know who runs China. It isn't Carrie Lam and other people against whom these sanctions have been placed. Can we sanction Xi Jinping? It would be good because the financial sanctions on Hong Kong would affect the fortunes of many people in his family and the fortunes of the families of other members of the Chinese Politburo. But Xi Jinping is the boss. There's one-man management in China. Sanctions should be imposed upon him, but they can't be. It's not politically feasible. So it shows the limitation of sanctions. There are other steps that can be taken, and Canada and the US and the UK and other democratic countries can welcome immigration to a greater extent than they have from the people of Hong Kong and provide them with the financial wherewithal to make that welcome realistic. Now, most of them won't want to come, and they may want to go to different places, but that's a real symbol, and it doesn't harm the people of Hong Kong. Anything we do can be mobilized by the propaganda apparatus in Beijing to foment greater nationalism in China. There's nothing we can do. That's what dictatorships do. But we have to be rational as best we can. And I think the foremost symbolic and effective measure we can take is to foster the possibility of immigration if people want to leave. I don't blame them if they don't want to leave. I admire those who will fight to the end. And many will decide, look, it's not so bad. People in China have given up their freedoms, but they have a good life in many places.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohen. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
And thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Let's move over to Mr. Harris for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And my first question is for Mr. Chu. And thank you all, by the way, for coming here today and offering your opinions and experience on this extremely important issue for Canada and for obviously Hong Kong and the world, in fact. Mr. Chu, you were just charged with an offense in China, a U.S. citizen, not living in Hong Kong. Can you tell us why you think you were charged? Is it because the strength of your organization? You've only been in existence since last September. Is it because of you personally, or is it because they want a symbol as well? And Professor Cohen talked about symbols, that the reach of this law can go beyond the boundaries of China, and in fact to a U.S. citizen acting in the United States, not in China. Can you give us just a comment on that?
Yes, and I think that specifically, I think up to last year, before we were formed, I think that much of the international support has been more symbolic and solidarity in nature. So, like, people have rallies and there's protests in Hong Kong. They come up and support. They, sometimes provide testimony like this to hearings in Western governments. But what has happened is that HKDC, particularly, was built to directly engage in the legislative lawmaking process and policy-making process. That activate and mobilize Hong Kongers who are U.S. citizens and residents to directly engage with their elected officials. I think that shift is a much larger threat in the minds of Hong Kong and Chinese authority. It's not just that we're unfurling banners in support of what's happening in Hong Kong, is that we're actually sitting down and using our American citizenship rights to engage in the lawmaking process, and thus shaping. In the last 9 months, we have actually been the driving force behind the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that was passed, the Protect Hong Kong Act that banned crowd control items to Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which recently passed, was signed to sanction financial institutions that are doing business with Chinese and Hong Kong officials. So I think that has escalated their level of threat as far as what they consider influential overseas.
So that's interesting that you pointed out there are 3 specific pieces of legislation in the United States related directly to Hong Kong, and that these are the mechanisms that the U.S. government is now using to target sanctions and do the kind of things that you talked about.
Exactly. And I just want to add one more note. I think we have heard from witnesses and folks who are in Hong Kong who has been questioned that the calling for sanctions, which we have done consistently, we have submitted names, evidence, we have talked to State Department officials and others to provide targets and why the rationale why U.S. should sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials. That appears to be one of the triggering point, is the mentioning and the advocacy of sanctions specifically that has led to the charges.
Does the actions by the Chinese government against the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, is that also defensive in your view? Are they concerned that the thirst for democracy that's demonstrated in Hong Kong by activists and by people seeking to enforce the basic law, are they concerned that there's a spillover to the mainland? Is that one of the reasons why they're being so particularly aggressive in their approach?
I think that this is actually the primary reason, in my view, is that they, as Professor Cohen talked about, that Xi Jinping is a one-person management. It is very difficult to hold together that kind of total control. And Hong Kong has been for years a place where they could not completely control and silence. And all of it is spilling over. And I think that I will even add that it is unusual and different because unlike Xinjiang and other regions within China or within the mainland, Hong Kong has experienced the freedom of speech and press and all the assembly and protests already, and they are trying to put it back into the box, and that is a much more difficult task than what they've done.
Thank you. I just want to have time for a quick question for Professor Cohen. You said in 2018 that that President Xi wields the greatest domestic power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, and yet there are increasing signs that his apparently untrammeled power is confronting quiet but growing resistance at home. Now, that was 2018. Do you still believe that, and has it diminished or increased?
I think it has increased because of the world's reaction to what's taking place in Hong Kong. And it's increased because of increasing concern over crisis in the Taiwan Strait and over economic problems. There are many intelligent members of the Communist Party leadership, and I know some of them, who are very unhappy with what the great leader is doing. And when things get worse, there's only one place people will look. They'll look at him. And these people aren't free to even talk to each other now. The surveillance of the party elite is so great. But there is great distrust. There's great doubt about the wisdom of Xi Jinping's increasingly assertive policies. We should not delude ourselves. We've seen enough in the history of Communist Party leadership rivalries to know this exists. And I hear from people confidentially, of course, many of the misgivings that people have. And I urge everybody to try to see this movie that was semi-humorous, but quite to the point, The Death of Stalin.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Harris. We'll now go on to the second round, and Mr. Albus for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to ask each one of you, perhaps starting with Ms. Boyajian, then to Mr. Cohen, and then finally with Mr. Chu, in 45 seconds or less, if you can, just because I want to survey all of our witnesses. If you could, we have over 300,000 Canadian citizens living in Hong Kong. As parliamentarians, should we be concerned for their personal safety, given all of we've seen in the past few months?
Thank you for that question. I believe, yes, you should. It would be an escalation to start to see wide-scale arrests of Canadian citizens, but it would not be unprecedented, as you've seen with Mr. Chu's case.
I think you have to be worried about their security for various reasons. It's possible if things get worse in Hong Kong, the violence could increase. And you could have some very serious violence, as you did in Beijing in 1989. More likely, however, is that your people in Hong Kong will have to be much more discreet, not only in what they say in public, but even in their business activities. They have to be very careful. And they could get bounced out of there by the Hong Kong government, not prosecuting them, but just ending their right to stay and ending their right to return to Hong Kong.
And I would just add that, yes, the short answer is that I think it should be a worried, but I think even more, so it's the uncertainty that it creates, right? Is that people are beginning to self-censor, or companies or other will get into a situation where they're wondering if they can do certain things and they can speak freely and operate as if, normal. And I think that effect also goes with the actual threat of the arrest itself.
I'm also concerned that if many chose, if they were in a position to leave, they may not because they have family members that are not Canadian citizens or other obligations. They may not have current identity documents to be able to get a new passport where they could travel as a Canadian citizen. So I appreciate each one of you giving those your views on it. I'm going to just quickly go to the Freedom Institute one more time. We've seen the rule of law. The rule of law was one of the pillars, I would say, behind the One China, Two Systems policy in Hong Kong in relation to that. It seems to be that mainland China is imposing its own laws and how they interpret them with such wide scope. You've mentioned your concern about Taiwan being the next area. Former Ambassador David Mulroney has said the government of Canada must completely rethink its foreign policy when it comes to China. Do you believe that this collapse of the One China, Two Systems policy by China itself deserves that level of response?
I do, is the short answer. I actually think now is a good time for every nation, not just Canada, to take a good hard look at its China policy. The national security law and the forced imposition of it in Hong Kong, and the fact that it really does reach everyone everywhere in the world is significant. And Chinese officials often like to talk about non-interference and sovereignty, but in fact, that's not a principle they actually believe in. They are seeking to set what everyone else is allowed to say and do, even in their own countries. And so it's critical to think creatively about China policy.
Thank you. And Mr. Chu, your organization is based in the United States. Today, the Secretary of State announced that for all intents and purposes, the Confucius Institutes will be now treated as a foreign mission of the PRC. Obviously, they're concerned about not just the suppression of rights for people such as yourself, domestic Americans, but also that countries such as the PRC are utilizing these kinds of institutes as foreign policy to influence domestic policy. Do you believe that other countries, do you believe A, is this a good step? And B, do you believe this is another approach that should be studied by other Western countries?
I think that what Ms. Boyajin had talked about, actually including Confucius Institute, but also media outlets, I think that there's been step in the last few weeks to label and explicitly call out state-owned, state-funded institutions or entity or corporations, including media outlets here in the U.S. and globally. I think that those are important steps. I want to be very careful that I think we want to make sure that it doesn't create sort of ethnic blowback on discriminations. But I think that being able to clearly see when something is state-backed and state-funded is a good step that I think Canadian government should consider.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Albus. And now we'll go on to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for taking the time, everyone, to give your important testimony. My question is directed to Mr. Chu. It must be very hard not to be able to speak to your parents. In your opening statement, you mentioned how simply retweeting can land you into trouble. How are people in Hong Kong now using social media to express their views?
Well, I think that we obviously saw, when as you saw in the Houston Rocket case where the general manager just retweeted something and China literally shut down basketball for a time for the whole country. And I think in my case, and then to your questions, I think people in Hong Kong are still engaging, but I think there's already been signs that they are being tracked. The 4 young activists that was arrested about 3 weeks ago were specifically picked up and arrested and charged for social media posting. And that is the same charge that Agnes Chow, another prominent leader that was arrested on Monday, is being targeted for, is that they are saying that she used social media as a way of engaging in inciting secessions and calling for foreign influence.
So it can be difficult for the people of Hong Kong on social media to respond to questions from foreign journalists and legislators about the situation in Hong Kong. How will they get their opinions out there then?
Well, I think as you have seen over the past 13 months, I think Hong Kongers have been very creative and very resilient. I think that you've seen even in the last just this week, Jimmy Lai, who was arrested, detained, and then released, immediately went on Twitter to do his weekly live with Jimmy Lai, and they're not being silenced. Joshua Wong, who's one that many consider to be a high target as well for China, wrote a op-ed for the New York Times yesterday that was published. So I think that you are seeing a society in Hong Kong that have experienced and exercised for decades and generations their freedom of speech and press and protest. And so I don't think that you will see a complete silence. I think that the cost will go up. The risk is already high, but I think you're already seeing people evolving in the ways that they're voicing and demonstrating their resistance.
Can you comment on the extent in which companies like Facebook, Google, and WhatsApp are cooperating with China and the national security law?
So I think that we actually even saw this before on June 4th this year in the memorial vigil that always gets organized in Hong Kong. Leading up to it, one of our former advisory board member, Lee Chuk-en, who's also the head of the Hong Kong Alliance right now, he was explicitly banned from Zoom, the platform that we're on, because Zoom actually issued a statement that says that the Chinese government asked them to suspend his account because of the event and meetings that he was hosting through Zoom. I think that is already happening. I think that that's a lot of the screening has already happened even before the national security law. But now, what is very important is that even though at this point temporarily, all the major tech companies have said that they're not sharing data with Hong Kong police and authorities, that is not a permanent setup. And at some point, do they turn over their data, or do they have a way of providing history of what people have written, even in direct public or private messages? I think that is a huge concern as far as what the tech companies will do long term.
Do you feel that TikTok is a national security threat? And will the ban be effective in limiting political China's interference?
So I'm not a cybersecurity expert. What I will say is that I think TikTok is a great illustration of the kind of complexity around both technology, supply chain, and data management that I think we have to really take a look at. And this is similar to the situation about the global supply chain, about personal protective equipment. I think what is revealing is that the infrastructure behind some of these technologies like TikTok, I think that it's not as simple as I think what some make it to be. It's not like they're listening to every TikTok, but the security of the data and the where it's stored and how it is used is definitely a national security concern because, again, if they are able to use those data under something like the national security law to prosecute, then that becomes a direct threat that I think people might not recognize exists right now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yip and Mr. Chu. We'll now go on to Mr. Jennis for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, we're hearing discussion and information about the interference in the lives of Canadians on Canadian soil as part of the broader neo-colonial project of the Chinese state. And I think this is something Canadians need to know about it and certainly become more concerned about it the more they hear about it. When we've, in the opposition, raised issues of Chinese state interference, we get what I see as a sort of ineffectual machismo response from the foreign affairs minister saying nobody better be doing this. We take it very seriously, but without actually substantively responding or taking action. And we heard testimony at the last committee meeting from Amnesty International that despite the kind of bluster, that the system is very ineffective in responding to victims of foreign interference who are seeking help and assistance, and also that just there isn't an effective or coordinated response at all here in Canada to foreign interference. So we're hoping to see the government proceed with policy and legislative changes, and to see the minister take action such as expelling diplomats when and where appropriate. I'd appreciate a brief comment just from all three of the witnesses on the things we can do to move from bluster to action to protect Canadians living in Canada from having their freedom of speech, their activities, their associations interfered with by a foreign government. So maybe we'll start with Ms. Boyajian on that.
Sure, thank you. So I think it's critical, you could kind of divide it into broad categories. There's a real need, I think, in democracies around the world, including Canada, for transparency. Where is information coming from? How is the United Front Work Department, which is China's propaganda agency, how have they infiltrated in Canada? What are they doing? So that's one step. The CCP does, of course, understand and respond to action. And so concrete actions, like I already mentioned, the imposition of sanctions, looking at imports and exports, getting your immigration system in order to help folks. But it is something that needs to be carefully balanced, because you're not looking to escalate things or, inspire racist attacks on anyone. And at Freedom House, we understand the challenges of TikTok and other apps, but it is a complex issue. We don't necessarily support a whole-scale banning of apps. So I think it starts with looking at the situation very carefully, what's actually happening, and then thinking about what concrete steps make the most sense, and more than words, but also actions. Yes.
Mr. Chu.
Yeah, I think that I echo everything that Ms. Boyajian just talked about, and I would just add that I think part of the protection here has to do with also recruiting businesses and other entities to also turn against the crackdowns and the suppression that is happening. I think what you're seeing, part of the purpose of the sanction, is not just punitively sanctioning individuals, but to force institutions like banks and financial institutions to not become explicit and proactive agent for the Chinese regime to enforce and support these kind of policy. So I do think that it's not just sort of the public rhetoric, but it's also using and recruiting other entities that has influence to be able to help strengthen the protection.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
I think you have to start with your relations with the Chinese security authorities. You have to make it clear to them that you will not tolerate any existing interference with the rights of Canadian citizens in their own country, and that you will take consequences, cause consequences, if they refuse to relent. I think you also have to make it more obvious to people of Chinese descent and others who are being coerced quietly in Canada by Chinese officialdom, that they have to make known to you, as well as to members of the executive branch of your government, what's going on. A very critical area is universities. We have had it in the United States, including my own university, examples where the Chinese consulate is very actively in touch with certain students from China in putting on certain events and trying to suppress other events, trying to restrict people from speaking out to challenge their own country's policies. I think you've got to make greater efforts at home, starting with Chinese officialdom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Jennis. And now Mr. Frederick for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to begin with Mr. Cohen. Professor, you spoke about sanctions earlier, and you've left us with quite a lot to think about as a committee on the efficacy or perhaps lack of efficacy with respect to sanctions. I'm still keeping a very open mind on this committee. I hear those calls in Canada that have been made to the Canadian government, urging that the Canadian government apply Magnitsky sanctions on Chinese officials, but you gave us an alternative view as to why that might not be the best approach. What would you counsel us as a committee, but also the Canadian government, with respect to possible actions that Canada could take as a country vis-a-vis China? We heard earlier, for example, from Mr. Albus, I believe, a very good question, about the safety and security of Canadians living abroad, living in China rather, or working there. But I also think about Canadians who are apprehended in China. We have 2 Canadian citizens that are very closely followed case. I'm sure you know about it. The case of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Canadians are quite rightly concerned about their plight. Are there particular trigger points that China would look at and be particularly not offended by, but that could pose a particular danger over others? So would sanctions be more of a cause where China would look at that and say, here's all the more reason to endanger the lives of Canadians in China over immigration measures? What are the trigger points that you see as far as this particular regime is concerned?
I think your government should be more vigorous in its protests and requests to the Chinese government about the treatment of Canadians in many respects. I've known of certain cases, and 1 or 2 I've been consulted actually, where the people who feel intimidated by the efforts of the Chinese government, whether to send people quietly to intimidate them in Canada or to use the telephone or financial pressures, they don't feel that your Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been vigorous enough in protecting their rights and telling the Chinese government to cut it out. Also on your cases, I don't know why your extradition process should take so long. Extradition is a complicated business, but your court system should be functioning far more quickly in handling the controversial Huawei case that is causing so much difficulty. This is going on forever. Even though Mrs. Munn is living in 2 wonderful houses in Vancouver, nevertheless, there are restrictions on her rights, however comfortable she is. And certainly look what it's doing to the people who have been unfairly retaliated against, the 2 Michaels, and even at least one of those who've been condemned to death who are Canadian nationals. This shouldn't go on forever. Extradition could take place more quickly. And
Thank you, Professor Cohen. With time remaining, and I can't speak to the efficiency of Canadian courts and processes in Canadian courts, but thank you for your view, Professor. Mr. Chu, with time remaining, just why now? Why this national security law now? President Xi has been in power since 2013. Leaders before him could have taken action in the same way. What particular set of factors pushed the Chinese regime and President Xi to act at this particular moment to come up with this particular law now in 2020?
25 seconds, please.
Yes. So I think that 2 particular factors. I think that this, the ongoing protest, the fact that it has lasted now in public eye under international watch for 13 months, have meant that what is happening in Hong Kong now create a direct threat to the stability of their control overall in China. And the second thing is that I think that, again, what we've done is to create a global intervention now at this point. And so I think that those are the 2 things that makes it particularly threatening to Xi.
Thank you. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bergeron, excusez-moi.
Monsieur Bergeron, you have 2.5 minutes. I'm going to piggyback on Mr. Fragiskatos' question. Mr. Xu, has this law been adopted because the government, the Hong Kong government, wasn't able to have the Extradition Act passed?
This goes beyond that. I think this is partly a reaction to, I mean, this is not the first attempt last year. It was not the first attempt for them to implement an extradition or security law. This has happened before. But I think that what is different and what it goes even further is that another feature that was very scary in this national security law is that there is now a Chinese security office on the ground operating in Hong Kong directly, outside of the jurisdiction of the Hong Kong government. And I think that what you're seeing is that this is one step further than just national security or extradition. This is now de facto Chinese enforcing and charging and investigating quote unquote crimes directly with Chinese security forces rather than actually having any involvement in the Hong Kong government.
Merci, merci, Monsieur Chiu. Une bonne partie de nos discussions durant le premier segment de cette séance portait sur l'intégrité du système judiciaire hongkongais sous cette loi sur la sécurité nationale. Le fait que le directeur des poursuites publiques de Hong Kong ait démissionné n'est-il pas une indication, une preuve que le système...
The fact that the public prosecution head in Hong Kong resign shows that now the courts are under the complete control of China. What would Mr. Cohen say? Mr. Cohen?
Given sufficient attention to the resignation of the director of public prosecutions. Here he is, the most important official for deciding who gets prosecuted in Hong Kong. And he's not even allowed to know what they're going to do about prosecutions under the new national security law. And I don't blame him for resigning. His boss, the director of the Department of Justice, the secretary, is a very nice, able person, but she's a commercial lawyer who was an expert on arbitration. I've arbitrated a case where I asked her to be the chief arbitrator. She's not an expert on criminal justice.
Thank you, Professor.
Decisions are being made by the security people from Beijing.
Thank you, Professor. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Harris, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses again. But I want to ask a question that all three of you can respond to, because you're all U.S. based. Although Professor Cohen has spent a lot of time elsewhere as well, and so few, Mr. Chiu, of course. The U.S. motivations are sometimes questioned in terms of its aggressiveness towards China in recent months and the last year, motivated by trade considerations, by commercial considerations, the politics of the president in an election year, combating the rise of China, etc. In the world and their influence in the world, and even talk of a new Cold War. And I'm just want to ask the question because that affects some people's attitude towards this, and how should Canada act towards China in a way that essentially distinguishes itself from some of these considerations, which are fairly obvious to us because we're so close, but may not be obvious to other parts of the world. But how do we act vigorously and importantly without being caught up into any of these other motivations?
Sure, shall I?
Start? No. Go ahead, whoever wants to start first. Ms. Bojayan, you haven't spoken yet in my response to me, so I'll let you go first.
Sure, happy to defer as well. Look, I would just say, regardless of who is in control, our position at Freedom House is that trade and security and human rights are inextricably linked. And so there was a lot of quote unquote business as usual across presidential administrations in the US, be it Bush or Obama. And so no matter who a leader is, of course, you don't want to act willy-nilly and escalate things unnecessarily. but human rights should be a major consideration, and especially now with the escalation of the national security law. And as I mentioned, we have seen growing efforts by the Chinese government to export repression beyond its own.
Thank you. Can we get Professor Cohen in on this, please?
I think we're in a very dangerous period until the American election is successfully concluded. It's obvious that the Trump people are exploiting China now in a way to get him reelected. It's the reverse of what Nixon did in '72. He exploited China to have a favorable change in our relations with China, following what Prime Minister Trudeau did in October 1970. Now we're going in the wrong direction. I think after the election, if things go well, we will have an improvement, a more balanced China policy. The danger now is throwing out the baby with the bath.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Harris. That concludes the time we have. I want to thank our witnesses. I know all members are deeply grateful to all of you for appearing, and I want to let members know that we are working on a possible 10:30 a.m. Eastern start on Monday in order to give time to deal with the motions that Mr. Jennis mentioned earlier. If that's agreed to by the whips, it will appear on the notice of meeting for Monday's meeting. And because we can't do it at 3, because another committee is starting at 3 o'clock on Monday. So that's the situation. That Mr. Jennis on that point.
Yeah, just and I would suggest, because these are substantive motions, not dealing with witness, that these be in public discussions. That's where we began the discussion of the motion. So I would suggest, and it facilitates the transition more easily as well.
That would be my expectation, actually. Although we will have to pause, of course, in order to give time to do the sound checks and so forth, as members will understand. So thank you all very much once again, especially to our witnesses and all the technicians and the analyst and our wonderful clerk, and everyone else who supported this meeting. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Merci, au revoir. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Appreciate it.